World have been struck by its stunning imprint of the face of Jesus Christ. Not everyone's convinced that the shroud is a genuine holy relic.
Ever since the shroud first really appears in history, there's been controversy about it, and there have been questions about its authenticity.
A previous pope wrote the shroud was, quote, a truly mysterious image which no human artistry was capable of producing. Lair, but we have the book, the broadcast, and now the app.
14 feet of ancient linen. A single piece of cloth scorched by fire, patched by nuns, kept for centuries in a silver chest, and somehow holding, within its weave, the front and the back of a crucified man. For more than 700 years, this object has done something that no relic in the Christian world can do. It has refused to be dismissed. Kings knelt before it. Scientists built entire careers trying to debunk it. And a photographer, working by accident in 1898, revealed a face that no painter of the Middle Ages should have been able to conceive. Then, in the autumn of 1988, 3 of the most respected scientific laboratories on Earth delivered what looked like a death sentence. A medieval date, 1260 to 1390, sealed in carbon atoms, announced to a waiting world. The case, most people assumed, was closed. The Shroud of Turin was a forgery. History moved on, except it did not, because the scientists had taken their sample from the one corner of the cloth that had been ravaged by fire and stitched back together by hand. Because a statistical reanalysis of their own published numbers argued that the 3 laboratories had not even fully agreed with one another. Because a new kind of X-ray dating, published in 2022, pointed at a linen far older than any medieval workshop. And because, beginning in 2015 and accelerating into 2026, DNA recovered from dust vacuumed off the cloth began to tell a story of its own. A story of plants from the Middle East, human genetic traces from across the ancient world, research published in leading scientific journals, coverage carried by the Vatican's own news service. And now, the institution that has guarded this object for more than 4 centuries is being watched for its reaction. Its spokespeople have said nothing definitive, and the silence hangs over the story like the burn marks on the linen. The shroud's physical existence is not in dispute. What it means very much is, it is a linen cloth roughly 4.5 meters long and just over a meter wide, woven in a herringbone pattern, bearing the faint image of an adult male who appears to have been scourged, crowned with thorns, and crucified, together with reddish stains consistent with blood. Its documented history begins in the 1350s in France, where it was displayed by a knight named Geoffroy de Charny. In 1453, it passed to the House of Savoy, and in 1578 it was moved to the city of Turin, where it has remained ever since. It survived a fire in 1532, and the burn marks and the repair patches sewn on afterward are still visible today. That detail will matter. In 1898, a man named Secondo Pia took the first photograph of the cloth and discovered, to his shock, that the negative revealed a detailed, positive-looking human face. An image vastly clearer than the faint impression on the linen itself. No medieval artist, even as critics concede, could plausibly have intended an image that would only become recognizable through a technology 500 years in the future. In 1978, an American team called the Shroud of Turin Research Project spent roughly 120 hours examining the cloth directly. They reported finding no paint, no pigment, no dye, and no stain that could account for the image. They reported that the image existed only on the outermost fibers of the threads, with no penetration into the fabric. In 1988, 3 accelerator mass spectrometry laboratories at Oxford, at Zurich, and at the University of Arizona independently radiocarbon dated a sample cut from the shroud's corner and reported a calibrated calendar age range, with at least 95% confidence of 1260 to 1390. Their results were published in the journal Nature. For most of the scientific world, that was the end of the argument. Except it was not, because consider what the facts require of anyone who wants a single, clean explanation. To call the shroud a medieval forgery, one must explain how a 14th century artist produced an image that exists only on the outermost fiber layer, with no binder, no brushstroke, and no pigment detectable by the most sophisticated instruments of the 1970s. An image that encodes 3-dimensional spatial information. Computer analysis confirmed that when the image was mapped into a three-dimensional relief of a human face and body, something no painting achieves. An image that renders anatomical details, wounds, blood flows, scourge marks that 14th century medical knowledge did not possess, and that forensic pathologists have since judged strikingly accurate. An image that only becomes fully visible as a coherent picture in photographic negative, a century before photography existed. To call the Shroud authentic, one must explain why radiocarbon dating, the gold standard of archaeology, placed the linen squarely in the Middle Ages, in 3 independent laboratories, published in the most prestigious scientific journal on Earth. And to call it simply a mystery, one must live with the fact that both camps have data, both camps have credentials, and neither camp can touch the other's evidence. That stalemate is the anomaly. It is not normal for a contested artifact to generate equally credible but mutually exclusive scientific verdicts. Usually, one side collapses under scrutiny. Here, the more closely the evidence is examined, the harder both verdicts become to kill. The 1988 sample deepens the puzzle. The corner from which it was cut, the only part of the cloth ever granted to science, is the same corner that suffered the 1532 fire and its medieval-era repairs. Supporters of the Shroud compare the situation to dating a museum tapestry by testing a thread from its modern hem. Defenders of the carbon dating counter that the sample was rigorously cleaned and that the medieval range was reproduced across 3 laboratories. Both statements are true. Neither statement resolves the question. And then, into this frozen battlefield, new weapons arrived. Genetics. When researchers extracted DNA from dust vacuumed off the Shroud decades earlier, they did not find a single, clean story. They found a chaos of biological signals. Plant species spanning the Middle East, the Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and beyond. Human mitochondrial lineages from multiple populations. Traces that looked like centuries of handling by thousands of pilgrims. Some read that chaos as contamination. The Shroud's long journey through churches, fires, exhibitions, and bare hands. Others read it as a signature, a cloth that traveled, truly, from one end of the ancient world to the other. Neither reading can be disproven, and that is exactly why the argument has never ended. In 2015, a team led by the geneticist Gianni Barcaccia at the University of Padua published in the journal Scientific Reports an analysis of DNA extracted from dust particles vacuumed from the Shroud in 1978 and 1988. They identified numerous plant species and multiple human mitochondrial lineages. The botanical evidence was consistent with species growing in the Middle East, North Africa, the Caucasus, and Asia. In their framing, the cloth had passed through regions consistent with the Eastern Mediterranean and the ancient trade routes beyond. And this line of research did not end there. In 2026, the same research program published a new analysis of DNA preserved in the official 1978 sample collection, reporting mitochondrial lineages preserved in the archival material. A related preprint described metagenomic sequencing of those same official samples. And the Vatican's own news service covered the research under a headline announcing that DNA research confirmed the Shroud's passage through the Middle East. Here, the story must be scrupulously honest about what DNA can and cannot do. DNA extracted from centuries-old dust cannot prove who touched the cloth. It cannot be linked to any specific historical person because no reference genome from a first-century Galilean exists for comparison, and geneticists are emphatic on this point. What DNA can do is describe a geographical biography, the plants and populations whose traces accumulated in the fabric over time. That is a circumstantial dossier, not a verdict, but it is a dossier that lands remarkably close to where the Shroud's traditional claimed history would predict. In parallel, the 2022 X-ray study measured the structural aging of flax cellulose in a thread from the 1988 sample corner and reported an age on the order of 2,000 years. 2 millennia at odds with carbon-14. The authors themselves present the technique as supplementary. Critics reply that it has no established dating pedigree. What the collision produces is a spectacle almost unique in archaeology. 2 physical dating methods, both published, pointing to 2 different centuries, neither persuading the other's partisans. Meanwhile, serological analyses reported over the decades have consistently identified the blood stains on the cloth as human blood group AB, a rare type in medieval Europe, but more characteristic of Middle Eastern populations. One 2024 review extended the observation to other relic textiles, noting the same blood group pattern repeatedly reported across several cloths. Critics note that confirming a blood group on a stain hundreds of years old pushes serological methods to their limits, and some earlier claims about pigment in the blood areas remain contested. And what of artificial intelligence? In recent years, neural networks and computer vision models have been applied to Shroud research. Automated three-dimensional reconstruction from the image's intensity data. Facial approximation studies. Machine learning classification of the image's statistical properties against known paintings, photographs, and thermal scorch patterns. What AI can do is detect correlations and structures that no human eye can hold in view at once. Whether the image's encoding is closer to contact imprinting, radiation patterning, or painted application. What AI cannot do is decide what the image means. No model can authenticate an identity because authenticity is a historical question, and every model is only as honest as the data it is fed, including the same contested samples, the same repair patches, and the same centuries of contamination. AI sharpens the arguments on both sides. It has not ended and cannot end the war. Now the stakes rise, because the disagreement is no longer between believers and skeptics alone. It is now inside science itself. The radiocarbon establishment stands by its 1988 result, and its defenders describe the medieval date as among the most carefully vetted measurements ever performed on a relic. The X-ray team stands equally firmly by its 2,000-year estimate, and its defenders describe the carbon result as compromised by the sample's damaged corner. The geneticists at Padua do not claim to have authenticated anything. Their papers speak of travel routes and contaminated dust. Yet their coverage on Vatican News has been read by millions as vindication. And the skeptics, watching the headlines multiply, warn of a more mundane failure mode. A relic that has been handled by thousands of pilgrims, exhibited under glass, kissed, burned, patched, and vacuumed is, in genetic terms, a public surface. DNA from dust is the archaeology of everyone who ever touched it, not of its maker. In that reading, the more DNA is found, the less it proves. Institutional hesitation adds another layer. The Church has not authorized new, destructive sampling since 1988. The single corner sample was the last one science was ever granted. Proposals for fresh tests, whether carbon redating of unscorched threads or full genome sequencing of the blood, have been discussed in the scholarly literature for years. None has produced a new official sample. The Catholic Church has never pronounced on the Shroud's authenticity. It neither endorses nor rejects it, and its silence is, officially, a position of custodial neutrality. The relic is an aid to contemplation, not a proof to be adjudicated. Any claim of a deliberate cover-up must be labeled exactly what it is. An allegation, repeated across decades of documentaries and comment sections, but supported by no documented directive, no internal memo, no whistleblower. What is documentable is different and arguably more interesting. An institution with the world's most controversial relic has, for 4 decades, declined every invitation to let the controversy be settled by new destructive testing, while privately, through its own news outlet, drawing attention to research that complicates the medieval verdict. Whether that is prudence, reverence, or something else, no one outside the Vatican can say. But here is the tension. If the Shroud is a genuine first-century burial cloth, new testing could confirm the most consequential archaeological discovery in history. If it is a forgery, new testing would quietly end a 700-year debate. Either outcome is publishable. Either outcome is historic. And either outcome, one might think, is something someone would want to know for certain. Instead, silence. So what remains are the interpretations, and the audience must weigh them. The first is the medieval forgery. The radiocarbon date is sound. The sample was adequately chosen. The image is a technical feat, perhaps achieved with heat or a stencil-like process, executed by an unknown artist in the 1350s to exploit the pilgrimage markets. a documented phenomenon of the era. Under this reading, the DNA is contamination, the X-ray method is unvalidated, and the photographic negative is an artifact of perception, not intention. The Shroud is a brilliant work of medieval craft, and the mystery is really about how it was made, not whom it shows. The second interpretation is the authentic first-century burial cloth. The linen, the pollen, the plant DNA, the blood chemistry, the anatomical detail, the unexplained physics of the image, and the contested carbon dating, together point to a genuine ancient cloth. Possibly the very cloth described in the Gospels as wrapped around a crucified body in Jerusalem. Under this reading, the medieval carbon result is a sampling artifact of a fire-damaged corner, argued statistically and materially by a credible minority of researchers. And the silence of the Vatican is the silence of an institution that knows it guards something beyond its own categories. The third interpretation is the skeptical middle, and perhaps the most intellectually honest one. The Shroud may be an ancient linen and a later creation, in either order. A real first-century cloth onto which an image was applied centuries afterward. Or a medieval cloth that passed through Middle Eastern hands along trade routes, accumulating its botanical and genetic signature through use, display, and veneration. This reading accepts every piece of evidence and draws no supernatural conclusion from any of it. It points out that old cloth and true relic are different claims, and that no test yet performed can bridge them. None of these interpretations can be disproven with existing data. That is the scandal of the Shroud. And for a storyteller, the gift. Step back, and the Shroud stops being a laboratory problem. It becomes a mirror. What is it about this piece of linen that refuses to leave the human imagination alone? It is not merely the face. It is what the face represents. The possibility that a physical object from the most consequential story in Western civilization has survived. Not as a text, not as a tradition, but as a thing, with threads you could count and stains you could sequence. The Church has said, for centuries, that faith does not require the relic to be real. But humans are not built that way. We want the artifact. We want the fingerprints. We want the DNA. In an age that trusts genetic evidence over testimony, the Shroud has quietly become the place where the two great authorities of modern life, empirical science and institutional faith, stand staring at each other across a single piece of cloth. Each holding evidence the other cannot answer. That is why this story matters beyond archaeology. It is a case study in how certainty is manufactured and contested, how the same data can be read as proof, contamination, or conspiracy, depending on the assumptions carried into the room. The radiocarbon lab, and the geneticist, and the Vatican archivist are not liars. They are interpreters of an object that seems to have been designed, by accident or by providence, to outlast every framework brought against it. What would it change if the Shroud were authenticated? For believers, little. The faith already precedes the cloth. For secular history, everything. A first-century forensic document of a crucified Judean man, preserved through fire and time, would be the most important textile on earth. What would it change if the Shroud were finally proven a forgery? For history, a footnote. For the millions who have traveled to Turin, wept before the image, and seen in it the face of divine suffering, nothing at all. The relic does not need to be authentic to have been believed, but the believers do not need it to be false to keep believing. Either way, the questions left on the table are not technical. They are human. What do we do with evidence that contradicts our institutions? Whom do we trust when the experts disagree? And how much truth are we willing to accept when the truth in either direction would end a mystery that has become, for many, more sacred than the answer? The Shroud of Turin is still in its silver chest, behind its bulletproof glass, in the cathedral of a northern Italian city. The Vatican has not spoken. The scientists have not agreed. The DNA is still being sequenced. The X-rays are still being debated. The carbon atoms have not changed their mind, and neither has anyone else. 40 years after 3 laboratories called it a forgery, the most tested artifact in human history remains the one object whose verdict science cannot deliver, and the Church will not pronounce. Somewhere in a room in Rome, there is almost certainly a decision about whether to ever allow fresh testing. That decision, whenever it comes, will be made in silence. And so one question remains, and it belongs not to the laboratories but to you. If the Shroud of Turin were proven, beyond any doubt, to be exactly what the faithful have always claimed, what would you do with that knowledge? Would it change your faith? Change your doubt? Change nothing at all? The cloth will not tell us. The silence will not break by itself. 14 feet of linen. 2 millennia of questions. 0 answers from the men who hold the keys. The door to the silver chest is still closed. And the only question that matters is the one staring back at you from the fabric itself. What do you think is behind it? A forgery? A relic? Or a question we were never meant to answer?